After that performance, how could you? Okay. Spade, tell me when we're ready to... We're ready? Okay, let's go then. Let's begin. I want to, first of all, say thank you for joining us by live stream. We are looking forward to continuing to work through some of the questions about worldviews and their implications tonight as we go through and do some overviewing of those things. But let's begin with prayer together and then proceed after that. Lord, we do give you thanks for your graciousness to us. Thank you, Father, for your blessings. And we ask, Lord, that you would guide our thinking tonight as we work through some of this material. Help us to think about thinking. Help us to understand what people who are in your image have gone through, how they've gone astray, and how they've been realigned into your word. I pray, Father, that you would bless our time together. In Jesus' name we pray these things. Amen. Colossians says that Paul exhorts us to take every thought captive unto the Lordship of Christ is the idea there. So this is a part of what we are trying to do, to be able to give a reason for the hope that is within us. So we have been engaged in 3 Wednesday nights of looking at worldviews and their implications, a summary of some of the major ones. And one of the largest categories is the category that we're going to be looking at tonight. We have looked at theism, we've looked at transcendentalism, and tonight we're going to be looking at naturalism. And there may be a time over the next week or so that Spate and I will gather some evening and put together a 4th talk just to bring together a few thoughts on one more anti-worldview, but one that permeates our culture today called postmodernism. So we'll see how that works out. If we're able to do that, we'll get information out to you when that's available to view. So just a little bit, if you haven't been with us in the other studies, we'll review with the definition of what a worldview is. Tolstoy asked questions of origins. Where did I come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? The question of purpose. What is my purpose? Why am I living? Why are we collectively here? The question of ethics. How do I know the difference between right and wrong? How do I universalize what I know to other people? Should I do that, or is it my own private ethical system? And the question of destiny. What happens after death? Do I live on? Is there something beyond this life? And how do I attain it, if there is? So those are some of the questions that are summarized as worldview questions. We said that a worldview is a framework for our most basic beliefs that shapes our view for the world and the basis of our decisions and actions. In other words, and again, this is review. A worldview is a view of the world. That is, as we look through the lens of these worldview glasses, we interpret the world and understand what we see through our worldview. But it's also a view for the world, because based on that, we react and respond and behave in certain ways. We said that it is the foundation for our values, what is primary, what our priorities are, and then flowing from that, our behavior, how we are to live. And ideas have consequences. This is not just an academic exercise. Ideas have huge consequences. If you are looking at the COVID-19 pandemic globally, and you are trying to understand what's the significance of this, what does it mean? If you are a Christian theist, you know that God is in control. He knew the end from the beginning, and He is sovereignly working through history and through these circumstances to bring about His will. If you are a transcendentalist, you have a different attitude. In fact, you are not. It's not even sure that you believe that this world exists. This material world exists. The reason why life is cheap in India is because of the transcendental worldview, because of their view also of karma and reincarnation and so forth. If you are a naturalist and you're looking at the pandemic, then basically you're saying we were unlucky. It's just chance, and if you die, that's just really bad luck. And the reason why life is cheap in communist China, in Russia, is because of naturalism, because people are regarded as expendable. When we were describing what worldviews are, I referenced the first Wednesday night, the quotation by Mortimer Adler: "More consequences for thought and action follow the affirmation or denial of God than from answering any other basic question." And we use that as the grid for dividing up worldviews. There are other ways of looking at worldviews and of categorizing them. But when Bill Brannon and I and John Stonestreet did the book on worldviews, we did it through the lens of the existence of God and the nature of God. Does God exist, and is He personal? Naturalism says no. Transcendentalism says yes, there's something beyond, but it's not a personal being. And theism says yes, a personal God exists and interacts and can enter into history. Now, of course, not everybody, well, here's what the worldviews are. Naturalism says the cosmos is all there is or ever was or ever will be. There's nothing beyond the material world. Transcendentalism says, I think a great quote that we found in Yoga Magazine: "We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. All reality is ultimately spiritual, and we become a part of the divine oneness. At the end of our existence, we are, as personal beings, cease to exist." And then theism, God is the creator. And if God is the creator, everything flows from that. The meta-narrative of the Christian worldview is that God forms, Satan deforms, Jesus transforms. That's the big picture. And He is the one with whom we have a relationship, and His will is the standard for what's right and what's wrong. So those are the basic worldviews, and I think I'm getting spayed. I'm not able to... Okay, all right. The postmodern idea has the world as we experience it, and this is what we may come back and look at in another session. So, if you look at the right column of worldviews and their children, the column on naturalism, this is where we're going to be skipping around a bit tonight. We're going to be looking at the outcomes of naturalism, the various ways in which we see it expressed in culture. Secular humanism, Marxism, speciesism, existentialism, nihilism, transhumanism, all kinds of isms that, as somebody said, when Jesus returns, they're going to become wasms. The naturalistic worldview says that, let's go back to that then. And let me mention, no one is consistent all the way across the board with their worldview. We live fragmented worldviews. For Christians, growing in consistency with our worldview is called sanctification, where we live what we believe. Now, when it comes to the worldview of naturalism, matter is all that there is or ever was or ever will be. In this worldview, history is linear. It's not cyclical like it is in a transcendental worldview. But it's also without purpose, which differs from a theistic worldview. So history is linear. It's heading in a direction. It doesn't have a purpose. It's not going anywhere. It's just going. And human beings are complex biological machines. That's all that we are. We differ from animals only in degree, not in kind. We are different kinds of animals. We are not created in the image of God. We are not the goal of evolution. There is no goal of evolution. And when we become extinct, we will individually not exist. We will corporately not exist. And there will be nothing more. And human evolution will continue. And evolution will simply continue on the planet after human beings are extinct. That's the idea that naturalism puts forth. So there's no morality except whatever you choose to import into your life. Morality implies accountability. But accountability to whom or to what standard? Morality implies ought. And all naturalism can tell you is what is. In other words, to use philosophical categories, ethics in naturalism is descriptive, not prescriptive. So there's no moral lawgiver or no being to whom we are accountable. Now, what this means is we're not necessarily to blame for our bad behavior. Because who defines our behavior as bad anyway? If you're consistent with the naturalistic worldview. Jeffrey Dahmer, serial killer and cannibal, interviewed in 1994 by Stone Phillips for Dateline NBC. He said that he had believed in evolution and that death ended everything. He said that if there was nothing else, why should I modify my behavior? Why shouldn't I kill and cannibalize my victims? That is what he said. Now, we're going to be looking at various attempts to bypass some of these implications and to somehow import meaning and significance. If you hold to naturalism as a worldview, then you really have a hard time living with that consistently. And so what we find are various attempts that people engage in to bring in meaning and significance into their worldview. But the problem is that not one of them rests on the foundation of naturalism. Not one of them. Most naturalists, for example, are determinists. That is, even though we have a sense of free will, there is no real free will because everything is matter. So I'm looking at BJ right there. BJ, what's going on in your brain right now is nothing more than cranial chemical reactions. You think, but I think you're wrong. So the idea is there really is only the perception of self-consciousness and the perception of free will. So at any rate, now I have grouped these children of naturalism together, and the point is not that they all identified themselves as naturalism and then took off in different directions. That's not the way that this worked. This was a post hoc description of what the worldview, of what their worldview became, and then you look at that and it goes back into naturalism. So that's how I have grouped these. So not everybody who is committed to naturalism has thought through the implications to a full-blown worldview. But what I'm going to be doing is exposing you to some of the public thinkers within naturalism. Because once you have this set of beliefs, how do you import meaning? How do you import significance into your existence? And some are more successful than others at doing it. So we're going to be looking at the big thinkers in naturalism, and I want to back up for just a moment and ask the question, why believe in naturalism? Why embrace this? Where did it come from as a worldview? Well, first of all, history shows that science, this is the rationale, science replaces superstition with fact. That the things that we thought of as mysteries of the universe actually have natural explanations, not supernatural explanations. First of all, the heavens were demystified with Copernicus and Galileo and Bruno, and Newton showed that they followed the same laws of motions and gravity all across the solar system. Edwin Hubble in the last century showed that there are more galaxies than our own. And by the way, do you remember, some of you may remember the Mars rock I believe it was in the early 90s, that people thought had some carbon-based life form in that rock, and it got debunked. There wasn't any. But for a moment, they thought, oh, we're not alone. And the idea there was, okay, if we find carbon-based life on Mars, then what that means is we don't have to answer the question of how did it all get started. How did the universe get started? Where did it matter? How did human evolution get started? They called it exoevolution, evolution from outside. Something came here and started the ball rolling. So now, of course, the question is, where did that come from? But that takes it back too far. The point is, you've got all of these explanations that are very natural, not supernatural. We're mapping the human genome, DNA. Life itself has become demystified. And when we look at DNA, we're not special. We're just like any other species, just differ here and there. Now, the whole of science, when it began, just science itself was anchored in the view of an understandable universe created by a God who ordered it according to his natural laws. And science developed from that. But as science continued to develop in over the centuries, physics didn't need metaphysics. When the Marquis de Laplace published his 5-volume Celestial Mechanics in 1827, as the story goes, he was describing the gravitational pull of the Earth, 5 volumes. He didn't say anything about God. He gave a pre-publication copy to Napoleon. As the story goes, Napoleon said, "You've written a large work on the universe without once mentioning the Creator." And Laplace replied, "I have no need of that hypothesis." So, first of all, history shows science replaces superstition with fact. Secondly, our present experience is all that we can know for certain is what we prove empirically. I mean, we thought someone was possessed by a demon, but they have epilepsy. We thought they were evil spirits, but now we realize that there was a virus or a microbe. We used to pray when women were infertile. And now we go to the OBGYN and get fertility drugs. So the point is, their point is, let's stop invoking the supernatural to explain what we don't now know. We will know it, hopefully, in the future. By the way, this is a philosophically non-falsifiable position that they've embraced. So that's our historical encroachment and our present experience, because we don't see the supernatural. And by the way, the whole thing would be solved if God would just show up. If theism is true, then why does God make it so hard to know that theism is true? All he has to do is appear. As Christians, we call that the incarnation. Remember Philip? Show us the Father, it's enough for us. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But this is the present experience of the naturalist argument. Isaac Asimov put it this way: I am an atheist out and out. It took me a long time to say it. I've been an atheist for years and years, but somehow I felt it was intellectually unrespectable to say one was an atheist because it assumed universal inductive knowledge that one did not have. Somehow it was better to say I was a humanist or an agnostic. I finally decided that I'm a creature of emotion as well as reason. Emotionally, I am an atheist. I don't have the evidence to prove God doesn't exist, but I so strongly suspect he doesn't that I don't want to waste my time. And the third historical rationale for embracing it is the implications, what it means if God does exist, which implies unbearable consequences. There's rules, there's a responsibility, there's what is regarded as intolerance. Paul Kurtz was the president of the American Humanist Association. He said, what kind of life can be said to be significant if we are totally dependent upon God for our existence and sustenance? Is not the life of an independent free man to be preferred to one of eternal bondage? For the free man, hell could not be worse. Thomas Nagel, who's still practicing still working at NYU, I believe, said it isn't just that I don't believe in God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. I thought that was quite honest. So I think we're getting the idea. We are nothing more than machines that think. We have an absolute beginning at birth, and we're going to have an absolute end at death, and that's going to be it. And since everything is caused materially, since all is matter, then even our thinking and self-consciousness is an illusion. We have no free will. That's a hard one for naturalists to be consistent with. But as we're going to see, they try to be. But what this means is that morality is nothing more than social conventions that we agree to together. But it's interesting, Johnny commits a crime. And the reason why Johnny commits a crime is that he was programmed to do that. I mean, he has no free will. This cranial chemical reactions are working, and so he has no moral blame for it. What's ironic about it is, in order to escape a predestinating God, they've fallen into a predestinated man. So, kind of interesting to think through that. So, at any rate, here's some more voices from regarding implications for naturalism. Buckminster Fuller, well-known public thinker of the last generation, wrote, "Man is a self-balancing 28-jointed biped, an electrochemical reduction plant, integral with the segregated stowages of special energy extracts and storage batteries for subsequent actuation of thousands of hydraulic and pneumatic pumps with motors attached, 62,000 miles of capillaries, millions of warning signal railroad and other conveyor systems, crushers, cranes, and a universally distributed telephone system needing no service for 70 years if well managed. The whole extraordinarily complex mechanism guided with exquisite precision from a turret in which are located telescopic and microscopic self-registering and recording range finders, a spectroscope, etc." You get the picture. Man is nothing more than an animal or a mechanistic machine. Stephen Jay Gould, the leading, probably the best-known evolutionary theorist at Harvard, wrote, who died about 20 years ago, wrote, "We are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures. Because the earth never froze entirely during the Ice Age, because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook, we may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists." And then, of course, Richard Dawkins, popularizer of atheism these days. "In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares, DNA just is, and we dance to its music." Now, the reason why I'm showing you these statements is because these are the public thinkers in the whole world, in the world of naturalism, and they have had the greatest impact. And I want you to understand that to the extent to which these thinkers are consistent with their worldview, the implications flow exactly as we are describing. For example, Bertrand Russell was describing the human condition. Amid such a world, and he's speaking of naturalism, if anywhere, our ideas henceforward must find a home. That man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving. That his origin, his growth, his hope and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only, now listen to this statement, only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. One more. Stephen Hawking, who died 2 years ago. And I hope what you're seeing, you're understanding that they are saying that as human beings, everything is determined. That is what Bertrand Russell was saying. Stephen Hawking actually indicated that if we could freeze frame the universe, and come up with some elaborate calculus to enter all the data of every molecule, and then take the whole universe off pause, then we could determine mathematically everything that was going to happen from that point on. And basically what he says is, well, we can't do that, so we might as well live as if we have free will, free agency. And you see this reflected in this quotation here. If everything is determined by some fundamental theory, then what we say about the theory is also determined by the theory. And why should it be determined to be correct rather than just plain wrong or irrelevant? My answer to this was to appeal to Darwin's theory of natural selection. Only those individuals who drew the appropriate conclusions about the world around them would be likely to survive and reproduce. If everything is determined, what becomes of free will and our responsibility for our actions? But the only objective test of whether an organism has free will is whether its behavior can be predicted. In the case of human beings, we're quite unable to use the fundamental laws to predict what people will do for two reasons. First, we cannot solve the equations for the very large number of particles involved. Secondly, even if we could, we couldn't stop the system, basically, is what he says here, in order to do that. He concludes, in summary, is everything determined? The answer is yes, it is. But it might as well not be, because we can never know what is determined. So, there you are. Here's the big picture, then, of naturalism. All that exists is natural, not supernatural, physical, not metaphysical. And once human life has no greater importance than a microbe. Only science is absolute. Spiritual and moral truth claims are relative. There's no reality to good or evil. They're perceptions. All values are based solely on personal preference. There's no reality, that is, to honor, beauty, love, truth, nobility, courage. The things that we say give purpose and meaning to our lives. There are no eternal consequences to pursuing my own desires. Any purpose or significance to my life is what I choose to impose on it, not anchored in some value external to me. And self-consciousness is an illusion, because we think, but it's nothing more than neurochemical reactions. Now, if you have this set of beliefs, how do you find meaning? How do you import meaning and purpose into your existence? Well, this is what those children of naturalism try to do, and I'm going to go through them kind of quickly. A couple of them I'm going to pause on because I just think, well, a couple of them are kind of fun, and a couple of them are quite already pretty well understood. So the time I allot to each one will be a little bit uneven. But the reason why there are so many different options is because if there is no God, then the guardrails for multiplying options to create your own meaning are gone. No guardrails for that. So you create your own truth, and nobody can tell you, by the way, if you're wrong. So here's the first one. Secular humanism. Man is the measure of all things. Our sense of connectedness with other humans gives meaning to life and provides ethical guidelines for behavior. And by the way, not all, many naturalists are transcendentalists. Not all. I'm getting my categories. Sorry. Many naturalists are humanists. Not all humanists are naturalists. So let me be clear about that. But if you look at the Humanist Manifesto, Manifesto 1, Manifesto 2, and Manifesto 3, basically what you have here is, if we're all we've got, let's be nice. Let's be nice to each other. Remember the Greek philosopher Protagoras? Man is a measure of all things. This is the basic premise for living, for ethics. It doesn't flow from naturalism, but it's the basic premise for secular humanism. Man is the measure of all things. Not individual man, but collectively. This puts humanity in center stage. For example, this is from the Humanist Manifesto. Traditional moral codes fail to meet the pressing needs of today and tomorrow. While there is much we do not know, humans are responsible for what we are or will become. No deity will save us. We must save ourselves. They go on and describe how sexuality is between consenting adults and all those kinds of things. And basically the idea is we be nice and don't hurt people. Well, where do those values come from? They don't come from the worldview on which they're supposed to rest. And by the way, the signatories of the Humanist Manifesto, really the main thinkers of the American Humanist Society, it's about 6 or 7 pages of the major thinkers of the world at that time, like the Huxleys, Isaac Asimov is one, Anthony Flew, many others who are a part. Kurt Vonnegut was one of them. So the idea here is humanity is on center stage. Humanism, this is from the American Humanist Association website. And by the way, this is their logo. If you see it from time to time, this is what they call it, the happy human. Humanism is a progressive life stance that without supernaturalism affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. See, it's a collective ethic. On what basis? Well, there's no basis really that's given. Kurt Vonnegut said, this was an interesting address that he made, and it was entitled, "God Bless You, Dr. Kevorkian." And if you know who Dr. Kevorkian is, that makes it quite ironic for him to say, "God bless you, Dr. Kevorkian." But here's what he says: "I'm a humanist, which means, in part, that I have tried to behave decently without any expectation of rewards or punishments after I'm dead," because that's the end of it. And this is one of the clearest statements of humanistic values. This is from Richard Robinson, a philosopher who wrote a book called An Atheist's Values. And you will see, as you look at this, that he is definitely a humanist cheerleader. "There is no God to make up for the limitations of our power, to rescue us whenever the forces affecting us get beyond our control, or provide us hereafter with an incorruptible haven of absolute certainty, security. We have no superhuman Father who is perfectly competent and benevolent, as we perhaps once supposed our actual Father to be. What attitude ought we to take up in view of this situation? It would be senseless to be rebellious, since there's no God to rebel against. It would be wrong to let disappointment or terror or apathy or folly overcome us. It would be wrong to be sad or sarcastic or cynical or indignant. Cheerfulness is part of courage, and courage is an essential part of the right attitude. Let us not tell ourselves a comforting tale of a Father in heaven because we are afraid to be alone, but bravely and cheerfully face whatever appears to be the truth. Our dignity and our finest occupation is to assert and maintain our own self-chosen goods as long as we can. Those great goods of beauty and truth and virtue. Add among the virtues, among the virtues it is proper to mention in this connection, above all the virtues of courage and love. There is no person in this universe to love us except ourselves. Therefore, let us love one another. Not quite sure how that follows. But the human race is alone. But individual men need not be alone because we have each other. We are brothers without a father. Let us all the more, you hear all the let us in here? Let us all the more for that behave brotherly to each other. The finest achievement for humanity is to recognize our predicament, including our insecurity and our coming extinction, and to maintain our cheerfulness and love and decency in spite of it. We have good things to contemplate and high things to do. Let us do them. Amen? Well, this is the cheerleader for humanist ethics. But on what basis does this view of life rest? Not on naturalism. So here we are. That's secular humanism focusing on really on a horizontal thing, placing man at the center of the system. By what authority is man placed at the center? Well, other children will call that into question, including the next one, Marxism. And I'm not going to spend time on this. We're familiar with the threat of Marxism, of Marxist communism. But just by way of summary, history is evolutionary and is understood as conflict between classes. The goal of social transformation is for the people to own the means of production, resulting in social and economic perfectibility. As a political system in history, it has contributed to racial and social genocide. I checked on this today. Estimated 100 million deaths in the Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia. So that as a worldview, Marxism is familiar to us. It is global, and it has reemerged in different forms, and it is ever present with us. The next one is called speciesism, the next child, and as I said, I'm just mentioning a couple and looking at the big picture of some others. Basically, this is an ethical outworking of naturalism, where we are encouraged to live in the awareness of our continuity with other species, since we're all just pretty much the same. Difference in degree, not in kind. And also, this takes it to the next step, to condemn anybody who gives preferential treatment to members of our own species, because that is the moral wrong. This particular view disagrees with humanism. Humanism places man at the center. Speciesism disagrees with that. All species are equal. Man is not the measure of all things. But it also disagrees with theism, because we believe that humanity is in the image of God and is therefore significantly different. I never know how to pronounce his name. Joaquin Phoenix, the actor, did an ad for PETA in which the face of a rooster was superimposed on the left. And you see and there's another picture that's from PETA on the right. And you can see what the analogy is. The analogy is based upon the arguments of racism and sexism. We recognize that we're not to engage in sexism where we value one gender over the other. That's the idea. And we recognize that we're not to engage in racism where we value one race over the other. In the same way, with racism and sexism, species are in morally equivalent categories as well. We don't value one species over the other. So you see various rallies regarding speciesism, and I just picked some of these off of the internet. And it was interesting that, again, they have the analogy. If you look at the sign on the left, the protest sign, racism, sexism, speciesism. And various protests, and this one I think is not in the United States. Various protests across the world for animal rights have taken place and are a part of the public discourse. Peter Singer is probably recognized as the main voice in this whole area. He didn't coin the term speciesism, but he made it popular. It was coined in the 1970s by a man named Richard Ryder, but Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher who recently retired from his teaching at Princeton. And basically, he argues this way. He describes the deviant tradition that members of Homo sapiens have any inherent sanctity of life. This is what he wrote. If we compared the characteristics of different individuals, irrespective of species, we would have to go much further down the evolutionary scale before we reached a point at which non-human animals had capacities as limited as the most severely retarded humans. Pigs, cows, chickens have a greater capacity to relate to others, better ability to communicate, and far more curiosity than most severely retarded humans. So if you don't believe in the sanctity of human life, that men are in the image of God, and you're following his argument, you'll find this article entitled, Should the Baby Live? And he has advocated in some cases active euthanasia of infants, infanticide, after they're born and they're found to be deformed in certain ways. It's kind of interesting. He has been publicly chastised by other academics because when his mother got Alzheimer's, he spent a lot of money to take good care of her. And again, that's the thing where this is hard to live with if you are consistent with the worldview that you are arguing for. In 1951, there was a movie called The Day the Earth Stood Still. If you were watching this at home and you have seen this movie, it starred Michael Rennie. Raise your hand. Oh, I see those hands. Well, in 1951, this movie was basically had the message that this being was sent from another planet, came in a flying saucer, landed on Earth, and the message was, put down your global weapons and cease from war. I'm not sure if it was the outcome of World War II and the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but that there seems to be pretty much of a straight line from that. So put down your weapons and cease from war. That was the message of that movie. And the phrase was, I came to save the world. That's what the alien said. I came to save the world. Well, this movie was remade in 2008 with Keanu Reeves, and the message was the same. I came to save the world. Only the application of the message was now different. Because now it was mankind that was a blight upon the world. And when he came to save the world, what he meant was he was going to wipe out our species so that the world could continue. So this is the way of thinking of this. I'm gonna move on a little bit faster here. Kind of interesting if you have seen some of the suggestions. This is just a curiosity. This is from PETA. Stop using anti-animal language. Instead of kill two birds with one stone, I can't read that. Feed two birds with one scone. Okay, instead of be the guinea pig, be the test tube. Instead of beat a dead horse, it's feed a fed horse, I think. Bring home the bacon, it's bring home the bagels. Well, you've got the idea. So you need to change your language so that you align with the right way of thinking. But the thinking is pretty serious because, I mean, a human couple lived in the primate section of the Denmark Zoo for a period of time because humans were classified as the other primates. So you have this couple living behind bars in the zoo, demonstrating the oneness and continuity with other species. So what do you do with the unwanted pregnancy? What do you do with the non-productive elderly, especially as Medicare is being drained? Well, there's just some interesting things here. Now, the next one is atheistic existentialism. That's the next child. It doesn't matter what you are committed to as long as you are committed to something. Just throw your life into something. And basically the idea is, if you look down at the third point, you become authentic as you make choices. This gives your life meaning. The fourth point, your final essence will be realized only just prior to your death. The only thing that you are supposed to do is you are to act, make choices. And there's no choice in advance that you should make because that would imply a standard by which you should make it. No, all you do is just act. So Jean-Paul Sartre says, basically, it is just as moral to help a little instead of helping a little old lady across the street, to push her in front of an oncoming bus. Both are actions. Both are morally equivalent. So in each case, you have chosen to act, but you might be careful about the police coming after that. Jean-Paul Sartre said, Dostoevsky said, if God doesn't exist, everything would be permissible. That is the very starting point of existentialism. Indeed, everything is permissible if God does not exist. If God does not exist, we find no values or commands to turn to which legitimate our conduct. And his point is we create our own individual values. David Cronenberg said, nothing is true. Morality is not absolute. It is only a human construct, very definitely able to change and susceptible to change and rethinking. And you can then be free to be unethical, immoral. Ultimately, if you are an existentialist and you don't believe in God and the judgment after death, then you can do anything you want. You can kill, you can do whatever society considers the most taboo thing. And by the way, he affirms that. Basically, in existentialism, you become who you want to be by making choices, and you basically have spent 70 years or so putting on a mask of who you want to become, and then you die, and the mask is ripped off, and that's it. That's it. There's nothing beyond that. There's nothing that exists. So, that kind of leads to what's called nihilism. If humanism is optimistic, cheerleader, nihilism is pessimistic. This is Albert Camus said, there is but one serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. So, should you kill yourself or not? Or as Hamlet said, to be or not to be? Or as Kansas said, all we are is dust in the wind. There is no meaning, so there's no reason to search for any. The only dilemma is whether or not we are to exist. And this is basically a very, very dreadful result of naturalism. Woody Allen said, more than at any other time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly. Which is a pretty funny, tongue-in-cheek observation. Nihilism is more of a feeling than a philosophy. There's no sense, there's no making sense of this world. We're born with no essence. There's no way to gain essence. There's no reason to pursue meaning. There's no reason to identify or pursue right or wrong. Values are hopeless. There is no hope. Accept it. Embrace the despair. And, in some cases, destroy all restrictive forces. So, and you find this expressed in art. You find this expressed in music. Some of you may have seen this particular work of art from Marcel Duchamp, 1917, called Fountain. Identified as the most intellectually captivating and challenging art piece of the 20th century. And it was a little bit over 100 years ago that this showed up in an art show. The reviewer who was writing about it said, whether the artist with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, because he calls it a fountain and he put it on its back, created a new thought for that object. And the revolutionary idea is art as concept rather than as object. It's not something that it's not a skill, it's a thought. That's why unskilled people can major in art. By the way, in 1999, this sold for $1,762,000, which is, I don't know, if you go to a plumbing company, I don't think they're that much. Samuel Beckett wrote the play Breath. He was a really well-known, very highly honored literary figure. And in this play, the play lasted 35 seconds. It had no actors. It had a cry off camera of a newborn baby. And then, I say off stage. And then the curtain goes back. And there's nothing on stage except intensifying light on a pile of garbage. Meanwhile, there is breathing in the background. And then eventually the light dims again. The curtain closes. And there's a breath expiring. 35 seconds, breath. And that's life. That was his parable for life. In Genesis 2:7, God breathed into man the breath of life. Very different worldview here. Douglas Adams wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And, we just don't have time to go into that. The basic idea is that we are just of no more value than pebbles on the sand, except that pebbles have longer life than we do. Now, I agree that the logical end of naturalism is this despair. You will rarely find full-fledged naturalists who take this to the logical conclusion of nihilism. That is where it goes. That is where it goes. Very rarely will you find a full-fledged nihilist. More often you will find them at faculty cocktail parties, holding forth their nihilistic views. And one public thinker, his name is Robert Capon, describes these philosophers, and he said, I can destroy their universal skepticism with 4 words. He says, I walk up to them and whisper, your fly is open. And every time they look, which a consistent epistemological skeptic and nihilist would not do. I'll leave that to you at home to decide whether that was a worthy observation. However, there are those who take this very, very seriously. And they become schizophrenic. Some have. They become mentally ill, like Nietzsche. Hemingway committed suicide. And others have become deeply depressed as a result of this. A couple more one more to close this out tonight. Transhumanism. Well, what do you do? Well, humanity is not necessarily the last step in the evolutionary stop in the evolutionary train. The question of origins, we created ourselves. The question of destiny, we refuse to die. So, we are going to recreate humanity 2.0. And you remember the quote by Buckminster Fuller about man being a 28-jointed biped? That flows right into the idea of this. And this is actually coming out in a number of books. Transhumanism, the next step in evolution. So you can, these are just some books I clipped and pasted from the internet on the topic of transhumanism and re-engineering humanity. So yeah, this is a thing that is out there. Max Hokett said, the non-existence of God makes more difference to some of us than to others. To me, it means there is no absolute morality, that moralities are sets of social conventions devised by humans to satisfy their need. I'm going to move on a little bit. Here is a summary. And if you think about it, if everything started with a Big Bang, and matter is all that there is, and putting aside the question of where matter came from, if matter is eternal, if there's no grand plan, then what follows from that? There is no explanation then for the natural laws that do exist. You can't state that the natural laws are there by design. There's no designer. So that's a huge gap, a huge jump. There's no explanation for human consciousness. You can say it's chemical reactions, but you can't deny that you have it and that is your lived experience. Good and evil, you have to say, good and evil does not exist. They're simply descriptive conventions. And suffering, things that we call bad, that's just bad luck. There's no purpose in it. Life has no purpose. There's no ought. There's only is. Human beings have no value over other species, and death ends the whole thing. That's it. You are annihilated. So, why should I be moral? Why should I have purpose? Is it not true that all we are is dust in the wind? Carrie Livgren from Kansas, who wrote that song, said at one point, there's got to be more to life than life. And then a few years later, he became a Christian. And now he's teaching Bible studies up in Montana or something, someplace. Still following the Lord. So, the only answer is biblical theism. There are many reasons for a biblical worldview, and I'm going to just close with a couple of observations here. There are a lot of things that we can say about apologetics, about giving a reason for the hope that's within you, about taking every thought captive. A lot of good, rational arguments for Christian theism. But one of the arguments is that alternative worldviews don't match reality. The transcendental worldview is something that you cannot live with. The naturalistic worldview is something that you cannot live with, either one of them consistently. The transcendental worldview, with its view of the world, the naturalistic worldview, with its view of ourselves, ideas have consequences. I mean, if all species are equal and no species should become extinct, if we isolate the COVID-19 virus, who is to say that simply because we're bigger, that it has less right to exist than we do? See, you get into some interesting questions here. There's an old parable of a oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to show you one more thing here. Jeffrey Dahmer, who basically said, why shouldn't I kill and cannibalize my victims? He added this: I have since come to believe that the Lord Jesus Christ is God, and that one day I and everyone else will be held accountable to Him. This was in his interview on Dateline. I watched it. And then that same year, a few months later, he was murdered by another prisoner. But that's a very big difference in worldviews that he came to embrace. There's an old parable of a zoologist who decided to study deep sea life using nets that had a 2-inch mesh. And after months of study, lowering his nets and observing what he caught in that net that had a 2-inch mesh, he concluded, amazingly, that there were no fish in the sea smaller than 2 inches. Who knew? For a naturalist, to assume that only the material world is real is to let significant reality slip through the net. It's too narrow. It doesn't explain the ultimate questions, Tolstoy's questions, origins, purpose, destiny, and so forth. It has no place for love, truth, beauty, honor, integrity, ethics, anchored within itself. Everything, all of those things slip through the net. So you have to manufacture the things that make life worth living and pretend that they're not really meaningful when they know good and well that they are. C.S. Lewis said, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe was cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. Atheism turned out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. God bless you, and we will see you on Sunday.